Greetings, everyone. Um, so, like I was saying, we had Psalm 118 waiting in the wings when we finished last time, and um, if we get to it again today, that'll be great. But I was thinking as we finish up Psalms, let's get to Psalm 23. I mean, let's do something that is a really loved piece, but let's also approach it from a way that looks at the background in the ancient Near East and see how that might inform how we look at it. And in doing that, I'm going to connect Psalm 23 with Psalm 22. And so I need to switch to screen sharing here. Okay. So, Psalm 22 starts out with this question, my God, why have you abandoned me? And we probably are familiar with verses that say, whoops, I don't want to go there yet. I'm trying to get rid of some menu stuff at the top of my screen, but I guess it's not going to go away. Sorry. We're used to verses where God promises, I will never leave you or forsake you. And this is really the same notion or even the same word here. And the psalmist, and of course Jesus himself, takes this on his lips while on the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why have you abandoned me? And on the one hand, it's kind of a jarring question. I mean, how do you say that to God when he's promised not to? How does Jesus, who is God, say it? What's going on with this phrase? And then how is that going to help us get into Psalm 23? So I wanted to spend a little bit of time on the background thinking about this idea of the gods, right? The plural polytheistic people's gods, abandoning them, and what's in their framework, and then kind of come back and work our way through Psalm 22 and Psalm 23. So we call this divine abandonment when the gods are going to leave the people alone, which typically means that they are left open to attack. They're left subject to harm by other forces because the deity is leaving them. And in the ancient world, there's a number of places where we can find these themes. The Sumerian city laments are the oldest. I think of Sumer as modern-day Kuwait, and a number of cities up and down the Tigris and Euphrates that are coming into the Persian Gulf there. That's where Sumer was. And there was a time when they were attacked, a number of the cities were destroyed, and then they wrote these lament psalms in their own language, the Sumerian language, and some of these themes of divine abandonment. Then we have an Akkadian. So this would be Assyrian. So you think of like Sennacherib. Okay. We have a poem there that incorporates a lot of these same motifs. And then we can even go into later Babylonian writings, such as one in the time of Esarhaddon when he's rebuilding Babylon, and then just to be someone citing sources. Daniel Block, who teaches up at Wheaton, has written a book called Gods of the Nations, and he's surveyed a lot of this literature in the ancient Near East, and I'm kind of pulling a lot of stuff from there and then using that to compare with scripture. So what happens in these Sumerian city laments is that the city is ruined because the protecting God has left it. But then when the deity looks back and sees the ruin and all the awfulness that has happened, the God has pity on the city and says, well, we ought to rebuild that. And so then he appoints a guardian for the city, appoints a human shepherd. So I know you're connecting already, Psalm 23, and the Lord is my shepherd. Shepherd is a metaphor for kingship in the ancient world. So when we read the Lord is my shepherd, in the back of our mind, we also need to be saying the Lord is my king. And so the human shepherd, the king, is supposed to reconstruct the main temple of whichever city it is. For this particular one, it's the Acor temple, and then start worship up again. And then finally, Enlil, who is their main, like their chief god, returns to his shrine. Then he brings all the people back, and first to the capital city, Nippur, and then he starts restoring the rest of the cities in Sumer. And then we have peace and prosperity again, because there's harmony between the gods. And then all of Sumer and Akkad. So I said Sumer was like ancient Kuwait. If you think of roughly the same size territory directly to the north of that, so in part of Iraq, that would be Akkad. And so now they're worshiping Enlil, who's the ruler. And so this motif of the god leaving is really the god leaving crappy stuff happening to people, the god having a change of attitude, and then bringing restoration for the people. So we jump ahead to the first millennium, and the Tukulti-Ninurta epic has some changes as it discusses things, because when it looks at the cause of destruction, it talks about the failings of humans, right? In the Sumerian ones, it was just, the god abandoned us, who can ever say what they do and why? But in this one, the people have been bad in some way. It's not necessarily what we think of as sin. In some of these stories, it's like, the humans are being too noisy and we need to do something about them. It reads like, parents who have a lot of little children and they're crying and making noise, and the parents just want peace, except it's gods and it's humans, and they go kill the people instead of try and comfort them. So there's human causation that torques off the gods, and they have some kind of emotional response to this annoyance. And then in this case now, Marduk is the chief god for this people group, and so he abandons the city or the kingdom, and there's a curse. And instead of simply the god leaving the city, it's the gods now actively take up the side of the attackers and assist in the destruction of the city. Then we move ahead another 3-4 centuries, and here's a Babylonian version of looking at this issue. And so it has kept the idea of the humans have provoked the deities to their anger, and so the gods have responded, and that's their motive, is they're just really upset. And the result of that is this disaster for the city. But then the deity has a change of heart and just takes pity because there's so much pain. And the deity comes back, and the deity picks a ruler, right, a shepherd king, and then we end with peace and prosperity. So those are elements that are in the surrounding nations, and we could look at more particular poems that they've written, but we see them kind of collecting them in a certain way, and they innovate, and they kind of have landed on this: the humans make the gods mad, the gods leave, the city gets wasted, the god has a change of attitude, and things get fixed. There's some similar stuff in Ezekiel, and I'm just bringing this up, I'll try and be quick with it so we get back to our psalm, just bringing this up to show how, because the themes are out there and resonate with the people, God can use those kind of themes to communicate with them, but he makes changes. Because now he's talking truth and violation of the covenant, and things that are part of God's revelation. And so he can use some of the themes that are out there in their culture, but he also doesn't simply adopt them. He changes them to match what he's actually doing. So in Ezekiel and all the prophets, they talk about moral sins, as well as when we talk about cultic crimes, it's just talking about improper worship of God. And so in the Bible, the issue has become immorality and sinfulness, and it is truly cast in terms of justice and judgment for things that are not trivial. Because there's hardly ever a moral issue in the human causation in the ancient Near Eastern materials. In a lot of cases in, say, Assyria and Babylon, when there's a defeat, it's taken as the other god is just stronger today. Hopefully our God will go work out and get stronger and beat that god up later. But the other god is stronger today, and the other army is stronger as a result. And the invading army usually comes into the temple and takes the idol that they all worship, and and pulls it out, maybe takes it home, maybe puts it in part of the temple complex of their chief deity or something like that. But Ezekiel, if you remember, Ezekiel sees several visions of the Lord, and in one of those, the Lord goes up from the Ark of the Covenant. He hovers over the holy place. He goes to the threshold of the temple. He goes to the east gate of Jerusalem. And then the Lord leaves. And this is well in advance of when, Babylon comes to destroy. And so Ezekiel's showing how, yes, because you violated the covenant, the consequences of the cursings in the covenant are now going to come to pass. But our God isn't being forced out by a strong enemy God. Our God is leaving on his own terms. It's not being taken out like a statue. In Ezekiel, the Lord does turn on his subjects, because he does say, I am punishing you, and I'm using this nation to do it. But completely different than anything else that happens in the ancient world, the Lord has Ezekiel tell them, but I'm going to go with you into the exile, and I'm going to protect you there, and I'm going to bring you back. And of course, Daniel even gives a timeline for that. There's nothing remotely like that in any of the ancient Near Eastern materials. So God's abandonment is simply a leaving of the temple in Jerusalem, but he's going with them into exile. And then the focus in Ezekiel then is not on the change of attitude that the God has, because the true God has always been intent on relational repair, and that's why he goes with them into exile. And so most of the content in Ezekiel then is centered on the people having a change of heart and turning back to God. Although briefly it is mentioned that God's attitude changes from judgment to regathering because of the people's repentance. And then we have stuff that looks like, pretty well matching up with what goes on in the ancient Near East. He regathers them to the homeland. He appoints a shepherd king, and there's a return in prosperity, and God returns to the temple. So we could actually look in a couple other Psalms and some other passages in the Old Testament, and how God's taking the set of themes that are there in the ancient world about a God leaving, abandoning, allowing destruction and coming back, and he's tweaking them. He's changing them to set it inside of his revelation of justice and inside of his pursuit of relationship with people, where the intention is always to have good relationship, and which is both protection and proper worship. So, just quickly then, there's kind of this schematic that develops in the ancient Near East, where we have some kind of acknowledgement of sin, but again, for the other nations, it's not really a moral sin. It's sort of some kind of mistake that the gods are angry about. Then the gods leave, and then the gods act against their people. There's some kind of restoration or a change of attitude. Those can occur in either order. And then we have the shepherd king theme, and we return to peace and prosperity, and the God, small g, is back in his or her temple. So let's look at Psalm 22 and 23 and kind of have that schematic in mind when we hear this awful question: my God, why have you abandoned me? Why is there such distance between my salvation and my groaning words? I call daily and you don't answer. I call nightly and I have no rest. So, a lot of complaint psalms or laments, they start with, oh God, hear my plea. It comes from a just mouth. That, we're initially asking God just to pay attention, and reasons why God should pay attention. And that's just skipped here in Psalm 22. He just opens up with this question, which is like an embedded accusation. Why have you abandoned me? Right? And so, how many times have we been in a relationship with someone and, maybe even sometimes it's our spouse, when they've let us down, we turn with this kind of harsh language and ask, why did you do this thing that shows that you don't love me? And it's not that they don't love me, but it's easy to do, and we can see that coming out at the start of this psalm. There's no preparatory remark. It's just, you abandoned me. Why? Ouch. But then there's some backpedaling. So why do we do this in the psalm? Probably to make the current feeling of abandonment seem more stark, because we go back and say, well, this you've done the opposite in the past, and it's what I want now, and I don't have it. So the second stanza is praise. Immediately after this accusation of abandonment, the second stanza is praise. You are holy, enthroned. You're the very praise of Israel. It was in you that our forefathers trusted. They trusted and you delivered them. So you see, even though it's like, okay, it's praise, you delivered them, but you haven't delivered me. So there's this undercurrent of, I'm saying something that you did, but are we saying it just to highlight that you aren't now, right? To you they cried and they were delivered. It was in you they trusted and they were not ashamed. But okay, here I am. I know Dr. Kreider went over communal laments. I listened to most of that. I can't remember whether he mentioned it or not, but most of the communal laments actually start with a section of praise, so that when you get to that lament part, it's in contrast to what God has done in the past. And it like makes the ouch a little more sting. And now he cycles back to what might be seen as that element of causation, where but it's not confession, right? He's struggling. So I'm a worm, not a human even. I'm a reproach to humanity. I'm despised by people. Everyone who sees me mocks me. They part their lips. They shake their heads. He trusted Yahweh. Let him deliver him. Let him rescue him, since he delights in him. So now he's talking about his own despair, his personal distress. And we would hear this around Jesus because he starts this psalm on the cross, and then we see this play out because all of the Roman guards around him are mocking him. The Pharisees are saying basically the equivalent. He trusted in the Lord, so he should deliver himself. Let him come down from the cross, then we'll believe him. Let's see that trust, or let's see that deliverance come for him right now. And so that's kind of the mocking that goes on both for the original psalmist, David, and then it's so fitting for Jesus on the cross. In fact, at the last second, I was thinking, could I pull this together? But I didn't think I would have enough time. But if we looked at it, the gospel accounts in Mark and Matthew, at least, they've been very deliberate about following Psalm 22 throughout the crucifixion account. There are several specific verses in Psalm 22 that you find in how they've cast that account, and so it's a significant thing to think through some Easter on why they've done that, how they've done that, and what it means for understanding of what Jesus does there. The next stanza in the psalm is contrasting this trust that he's had with the. So if we were in a covenant context, it would usually be God who is saying, here's all the stuff that I have done to take care of you, and so that's why it's not appropriate for you to have left me and gone on the path of sinfulness and injustice and all that sort of thing. Here the psalmist is flipping it, saying that I've always been one to trust you, right? I was raised to trust you from the beginning. While I was on my mother's breast, I had my confidence in you. Since I was born, my God has been you. And that's why it's so unfair that you are far from me. And so then he moves into petition. Don't be far. Trouble is near. There's no one that can help. And there are a number of lament psalms that they appeal to God simply because I'm in trouble. Even when the lament psalm is one where they confess their sin and they say, like, I deserve it. I did this, and I'm getting the legal remedy that's in the covenant. I deserve it, but it's awful and it hurts. And so please take pity on me in the midst of my pain. And he's making that same appeal. We just haven't had a lot in the way of confession at this point. Then he switches, or the next stanza is an accusation against, and we don't see the bull imagery in the crucifixion account, but we see this, what it represents is played out in the mocking of the people around Jesus on the cross. So they have surrounded me. Many bulls, mighty bulls of Bashan have encircled me. They've snapped their mouths like a lion tearing and roaring. So you have this picture of being surrounded by an angry mob, an angry crowd, a bunch of rioters, people who are yelling stuff at you, and it's completely intimidating, and you feel overwhelmed and fearful. And so it's a great it's a great physical picture. I don't know how many of us have done much farming. I didn't grow up on a farm, but I had some relatives who had farms. I remember one time being on a farm, and there were just a few cows around, but for whatever reason, one of them decided to charge at me. And fortunately, there was a tree not far away, and I could use that as something in between. But you get this initial rush of this could go not well, and that's the the picture that he has here by picturing many bulls. We Heidi that did a lot of farming's not the right word, but sheep, goats, cows, bulls, they're familiar with a setting like that. And if you use the imagery of bulls that are angry, that are closing in on you, I think they resonate with it quickly, and the level of fear that comes with it. He switches back to personal distress, and again, we see this on Jesus on the cross pretty clearly. All my bones are out of joint, but none of them. They don't break his legs when he's on the cross. But the original picture is just one of pain. So all my energy is spent. I'm poured out. If you could actually imagine all your bones being out of joint, I'm sure it's a picture. But I've occasionally thrown my shoulder out of joint or something else, and it can hurt a lot. And if you think of trying to place that pain at every joint in your body, he's creating that picture of distress. My heart is like wax; it has melted in my belly. So the picture here is just complete discouragement and despair. Right? When your heart melts like wax in Old Testament imagery, it's your courage is completely lost. And so then my strength is dried up like a piece of pottery. My tongue gets stuck to my gums. They have set me on deathland's dust. So his level of physical pain is high. His level of discouragement is very high. And it has him thinking that he's not going to live through this, right? If we picture the underworld as the land of death, it's like I'm more or less have landed there in the dust of that place, and I'm just this far away from being dead, right? Which again fits the cross very well. Then the next stanza, he continues with accusation against the enemies. So instead of bulls this time, the picture is dogs. Right? The dogs have surrounded me. A gang of villains has closed in around me. So depending on what you've seen on the news about the riots or something like that, if you've seen any camera shots that have really been inside the rioters' actions where it's looked scary, I mean, that is the picture here. A gang of villains has closed in around me. They've pierced my hands and feet. I can count all my bones. And of course that resonates with the picture of Jesus on the cross as well. And so we're getting a long description of the distress that has occurred because God has abandoned the king. So they stare at me, and they divide my garments, for my clothes they gamble. And of course, at the time of the crucifixion, the Roman guards do this unwitting that they are following what has happened in Psalm 22. And so now we come to petition. So we've got this schematic where there would be some kind of offense that the God gets angry about and leaves. And then we have distress. And a lot of our psalm here is focused on distress. We haven't had much in the way of, human causation, the person who's being afflicted talking about their sins, which is an interesting point we'll come back to. But now we're petitioning God to have that change of attitude and bring about the salvation that's expected in the sequence. So don't be far off. You've abandoned me, but don't stay far off. Hasten to my aid. Deliver my soul from the sword, from the claws of dogs. Deliver my only life. Save me from the lion's mouth and from the wild oxen's horns. Answer me. So it's a really desperate cry for God to intervene and change the distress that he's in. the next stanza then is a vow to praise and a call for other people to praise God. So it seems like this huge transition in emotional attitude, because we've heard distress, 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 attack from the enemies, personal distress, attack from the enemies. Please don't stay far away. And this is what shows us that even when the psalmist is in despair, or the closest thing to despair, the psalmist still has a certain confidence in God, because why would you even come to God with this complaint if you didn't think he'd listen? Right? If you don't bring, Robin talked about this too, I think, but it's okay to bring the complaint. If we don't bring the complaint, that's a lack of faith. So it's like, I know I grew up in a situation where complaining was treated as not trusting God, but the way the psalmists actually do it, bringing the complaint to God, is because you trust in him in order to hear and answer. And anticipating that God will act at some point, sooner rather than later is preferred, but at some point, the psalmist is already praising, before anything that has happened that God has done for him, that he's going to praise God to everybody else. I'm going to go to, I'll say, church. He'll go to temple. He'll go to the assembly, and I will be praising you, and I will be calling everybody else to praise you. You who fear Yahweh, praise him. All of Jacob's descendants honor him. Revere him, all of Israel's descendants. I'm not going to use my distress to turn people away from God and say that God isn't capable or isn't, it doesn't take care of us. I'm going to use your deliverance from my distress that I haven't seen any of yet as a cause for praise and to promote loyalty. And so then he gives motivation to the people, even though it hasn't happened yet. He just believes in God's underlying covenant commitment to him. So he says he has not despised. He has not recoiled at the affliction of the afflicted one. God didn't look at me in my distress and say, you're just a crummy person, right? He doesn't pull back. I think sometimes of like my daughter, who's a nurse, who's like seen everything, every sort of wound and every sort of bodily fluid and every smell of stench and things that might make a common person recoil a bit. And you move toward it with healing. He has not hidden his face, which is an interesting claim, because when we say he's abandoned me in the first verse, hiding his face is a metaphor for that. And so to say, why have you abandoned me? And then say he hasn't hidden my face is like to reverse that initial accusation. He actually heard, right? That's why I brought the complaint. Even though it sounds messy, I trusted that he would hear, and he heard. And so from you is my praise in the great assembly. I will pay my vows in the presence of those who fear him. And the end of the psalm has several stanzas of confidence in God's reign. And so if we're looking at that ancient Near Eastern kind of schematic, when the God does have a change of attitude, then we are going to have God reign, and things will be restored. So he says, the oppressed will eat and will be satisfied. Those who seek him will praise Yahweh. They will say, let your heart live forever. They will remember. They will turn to Yahweh. All the ends of the earth will. They will bow before you. All the nations' families will. Dominion belongs to Yahweh. He's the ruler of the nations. Surely to him they will bow. All the robust of the earth will bow. Before him they will bend down, each one headed down to the dust, right? So another figure of death, because we're all destined for that. But we will all bow before him. And then our descendants will serve him. And it will be reported of the Lord to the next generation. They will report his righteousness and saying, indeed, he has done it. When we come to Psalm 23, then, we're looking for where was the divine appointment of a shepherd? And we start, and I actually lean toward thinking that Psalm 22 and 23 were originally one psalm, and Psalm 23 was a section of confidence that they would sometimes break off and use on its own in a worship service. And it opens then with I think this is the King's Voice saying, Yahweh, or the Lord is my shepherd, I will not lack. So in the place where we're expecting the appointment of a human shepherd, the king says, Yahweh is my shepherd. And so he makes a twist on the schematic and reminds everybody that he, the Davidic king, is really not that important. What's important is that the Lord is my shepherd, but that's the picture of being the king. The Lord's the real king. And so I will not lack. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside calm waters. This is, I think, the same voice that was just saying, you've abandoned me. I'm surrounded by bulls. They're mocking me. They're tearing at me. I'm surrounded by dogs. It's awful. How are you going to get me out of here? That same voice is saying, he makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside calm waters. He restores my soul, right? So that theme of restoration that we had begun to see at the end of Psalm 22 that fits the schematic is also showing up here in Psalm 23. He restores my soul. He leads me on straight paths or on righteous paths for his name's sake. And then he's going to flip the whole picture of the distress. Even when I walk in the darkest valley, which he was just talking about in Psalm 22, I will not fear harm. It sounded like you were fearing harm back then. Okay, I was wrestling with some stuff, but bedrock was I turned to the Lord with confidence. And so when I walk through that stuff, I still not fear, at least ultimate harm, because you're with me. Your rod and your staff, those are instruments of judgment. Well, I find comfort in them. I can look back on that distress that I talked about in Psalm 22 and say, you prepare a table before me in the presence of or across from my enemies, my adversaries. You've anointed my head with oil, my cup overflows. So if you think of Jesus on the cross, starting Psalm 22, and the gospel writers don't have him quoting the entire thing, but it's very possible that he actually did, that he quotes all the way through Psalm 22 and Psalm 23 while he's on the cross. And that they've just used verse 1 as an indicator for us for what Jesus is saying. So on the one hand, he talks about that distress, and I can count all my bones, and they're dividing my clothes, and all the things that the gospel writers are portraying that match Psalm 22. But then he's also saying, I have an alternate perspective on the exact same experience, which is that actually you've prepared a feast for me when surrounded by harm, enemies, adversaries, mockers, Roman guards, etc. In the middle of all that, my perspective, and taking Christ's perspective here, is that you've anointed my head with oil. You've made me the Messiah. And so my cup overflows. And you think again about the gospel accounts and that imagery of the cup, at Gethsemane, he's like, is there any way I cannot take this cup? Because their cup is this image of punishment. You've got to take what's coming to you. And Jesus is looking for any other way to do it. But he yields to the decision of the Father. Here, to the degree that Psalm 22 and 23 apply to him, he's saying, actually, my cup is abundant. It's overflowing. Surely goodness and loyal love will pursue me all the days of my life, and I will dwell at Yahweh's house for endless days. And so, in the original setting, we've had the king, the person who was the human shepherd appointed by the deity, instead turn the metaphor around and say, no, you're the shepherd, you're the king, and even when I'm surrounded by all this hardship, I look to you for protection and look back on it and say, you provided in the middle of that, and I'm anticipating endless days at Yahweh's house. And then for Jesus, since he actually is the shepherd king, he's now accomplished that for all of us, because the rest of us only have this access to his house and to his throne room so readily because of what he's done. And his goodness and his loyal love is pursuing us all the days of our life because we were associated with him in what he has accomplished. So just kind of going back to, and I see we're not going to get to Psalm 118 again, and that's fine. We're looking for this kind of scheme of acknowledgement of sin, God's voluntary abandonment, the God acting against the people, some kind of restoration, change of attitude, appointment of the shepherd king, and then peace and prosperity, and the return to God's temple. And what we find here is we don't have an acknowledgement of sin, and that's especially fitting insofar as this is a picture of Christ, but we have affirmed the Lord's holiness pretty near the beginning of the psalm. The God's voluntary abandonment seems to be present right at the beginning. Why have you abandoned me? Nobody's captured the God or captured the Lord and taken him away from the psalmist. The God would act against his people, and Psalm 22 asks for God to help against the enemies, because normally in the scheme, if the God removes his protection, then the enemies can attack. And of course, for Jesus, the enemies were allowed to attack. Where we look for a change of disposition, in the ancient world, it's much more the deity having the change of attitude, but as we saw in our run through of Ezekiel, the change of disposition becomes more that of the people who return to God. Here it's more the psalmist's change of mood, because he switches to that confidence that I'm going to make a vow to praise you after you've delivered me, saying that in the middle of a time when God hasn't acted yet to help him, just anticipate it in faith. And we have the people turning to God near the end of Psalm 22, where the ancient world would have looked for the appointment of the shepherd king. We have the Davidic king saying, Yahweh is my shepherd. And so he deflects that role of kingship back to God. Where we're expecting the return of peace and prosperity, we do see provision in Psalm 23. And instead of talking about the God returning to the temple, Psalm 23 talks about how we now are able to dwell at Yahweh's house. And so, sometimes it's very helpful or useful to have an awareness of what the ancient world had as its worldview, to see how what God does in the Bible is making adjustments or changes in order to communicate his message. And then in the case of Psalm 22 and 23, it goes up one more level, because it becomes messianic, and it describes the whole crucifixion and the resurrection, which would be, where the return of peace and prosperity is, and our access to God and his heavenly temple as a result of all of that.